This is Brother Peter Diamond, VaticanCatholic.com. I want to talk about the Great Western Schism and the gates of hell. The Great Western Schism, which took place between 1378 and 1417, was a period of church history which featured massive confusion, multiple antipopes, an antipope in Rome, and an antipope recognized by all of the cardinals. This is an extremely important period of church history. In order to understand what Christ meant by his promise, the gates of hell will not prevail against his church, and what that does not preclude, it's critical for those who profess to be Catholics to understand this period of church history. I'm now going to discuss it in detail. For some of the references to the quotes I give, see our article on this topic. The conclave in the Vatican, 1378, after Pope Gregory XI's death, was the first to meet in Rome since 1303. The popes had resided in Avignon for approximately 70 years due to political turmoil. The conclave was held amid scenes of unprecedented uproar. Since France had become the home of the popes for the last 70 years, the Roman mob surrounding the conclave was quite unruly, and clamored for the cardinals to elect a Roman, or at least an Italian. At one point, when it was believed that a Frenchman had been elected instead of an Italian, the mob stormed the palace. Quote, "In a fury, the mob now began throwing stones at the windows of the palace and attacking the doors with picks and axes. There was no effective defending force. The crowd stormed in." End quote. Eventually, an Italian, Pope Urban VI, was elected by 16 cardinals. The new pope asked the cardinals if they had elected him freely and canonically. They said they had. Shortly after the election, the 16 cardinals who had elected Urban VI wrote to the 6 cardinals who had remained stubbornly at Avignon. Quote, "We have given our votes for Bartolomeo, the Archbishop of Bari, Urban VI, who is conspicuous for his great merits, and whose manifold virtues make him a shining example. We have in full agreement elevated him to the summit of apostolic excellence, and have announced our choice to the multitude of Christians." End quote. The cardinals reject Pope Urban VI under the pretext of the unruly Roman mob. Shortly after his election, however, Pope Urban VI began to alienate the cardinals. Quote, "The French cardinals, who formed the majority in the Sacred College, were dissatisfied with the city and wished to return to Avignon in France, where there were no dilapidated basilicas and ruined palaces, no tumultuous Roman mobs and deadly Roman fevers, where life was, in a word, more comfortable. Urban VI refused to leave Rome, and his stern resolve, intimated to them in no mincing words, to reform the papal court and break down the luxury of its life, gave deep offense to the cardinals." End quote. One by one the cardinals went to Anagni in France to vacation. Quote, "The new pope, suspecting nothing, had given them permission to go there for the summer. In mid-July they agreed among themselves that the April election had been invalid due to duress by the surrounding mob, and that, using this as a reason, they would withdraw recognition from Urban VI." End quote. After the news of the cardinals' decision to repudiate Urban VI had been circulated, the canonist Baldus, considered the most famous jurist of the day, published a treatise disagreeing with their decision. In it he stated, quote, "There were no grounds on which the cardinals could repudiate a pope once they had elected him, and none on which the Church as a whole could depose him, except persistent and open heresy." End quote. Despite the imprecision in this statement by Baldus, for a true pope can never be deposed, a heretic deposes himself, we can clearly see in his words the commonly acknowledged truth that a claimant to the papacy who is openly and persistently heretical can be rejected as a non-pope, since he is outside the Church. All of the living cardinals reject Pope Urban VI and recognize an antipope. On July 20th, 1378, 15 of the 16 cardinals who had elected Pope Urban VI withdrew from his obedience on the grounds that the unruly Roman mob had made the election uncanonical. The one cardinal who did not repudiate Pope Urban VI was Cardinal Tebaldeschi, but he died shortly thereafter on September 7th, leaving a situation where not one of the cardinals of the Catholic Church recognized the true pope, Urban VI. All of the living cardinals now regarded his election as invalid. After repudiating Urban VI, on September 20th, 1378, the cardinals proceeded to elect Clement VII as, quote, pope, who set up his rival papacy in Avignon. The Great Schism of the West had begun. Quote, the rebel cardinals then wrote to the European courts explaining their action. Charles V of France and the whole French nation immediately acknowledged Clement VII, as did also Flanders, Spain, and Scotland, the Empire and England, with the northern and eastern nations and most of the Italian republics, adhered to Urban VI. End quote. Even though the validity of the election of Pope Urban VI was ascertainable, one can see why many were taken in by the argument that the Roman mob had unlawfully influenced his election, thereby rendering it uncanonical. Moreover, one can see how the position of anti-Pope Clement VII was strengthened considerably and imposingly in the eyes of many by the fact that 15 out of the 16 cardinals who had elected Urban VI came to repudiate his election as invalid. The situation that resulted after anti-Pope Clement VII's acceptance by the cardinals was a nightmare from the very beginning, a nightmare which shows us how bad and confusing God will sometimes allow things to get without violating the essential promises he made to his church. Quote, the schism was now an accomplished fact, and for 40 years Christendom was treated with the melancholy spectacle of 2 and even 3 rival popes claiming its allegiance. It was the most perilous crisis through which the Church had ever passed. Both popes declared a crusade against each other. Each of the popes claimed the right to create cardinals and to confirm archbishops, bishops, and abbots, so that there were 2 colleges of cardinals, and in many places 2 claimants for the high positions in the Church. Each pope attempted to collect all the ecclesiastical revenues, and each excommunicated the other. End quote. The spectacle continued as popes and anti-popes alike died, only to be succeeded by more. Pope Urban VI died in 1389, and was succeeded by Pope Boniface IX, who reigned from 1389 to 1404. After Boniface IX's election, he was promptly excommunicated by anti-Pope Clement VII, and he responded by excommunicating him. During his reign, Pope Boniface IX, quote, was unable to enlarge his sphere of influence in Europe. Sicily and Genoa actually fell away from him. Cardinals of both camps take an oath to work to end the schism prior to participating in new elections, which demonstrates how bad the situation had become. Meanwhile, at Avignon, anti-Pope Clement VII died in 1394. Before electing anti-Pope Clement VII's successor, all 21 cardinals, quote, swore to work for the elimination of the schism, each undertaking, if elected, to abdicate if and when the majority judged it proper. End quote. Keep this in mind, as it will become relevant when we cover why a third claimant to the papacy came into the picture. The cardinals at Avignon proceeded to elect Pedro de Luna, anti-Pope Benedict XIII, to succeed anti-Pope Clement VII. Benedict XIII reigned as the Avignon claimant for the rest of the schism. For some time, Benedict XIII had in his support none other than the miracle-working Dominican, St. Vincent Ferrer. St. Vincent actually served as his confessor for a time, believing the Avignon line to be the valid line, until sometime later on in the schism. St. Vincent had obviously been persuaded that Pope Urban VI's election was invalid, due to the unruly Roman mob, in addition to the formidable acceptance of the Avignon line by 15 out of the 16 cardinals who had taken part in Urban VI's election. As a cardinal, anti-Pope Benedict XIII had originally taken part himself in the election of Pope Urban VI, and then abandoned Urban and helped elect Clement, having of course been convinced that Urban's election was invalid. As a cardinal under anti-Pope Clement VII, Benedict XIII, quote, went to the Iberian Peninsula for 11 years as his legate, and by his diplomacy swung Aragon, Castile, Navarre, and Portugal to his, that is, anti-Pope Clement VII's, obedience." End quote. After having sworn to pursue the path of abdication in order to end the schism, if the majority of his cardinals agreed, anti-Pope Benedict XIII alienated many of his cardinals when he went back on his promise and showed himself unwilling to consider abdication, even though the majority of his cardinals wanted him to. His rival, Pope Boniface IX, was equally unwilling. In 1404, Pope Boniface IX, the successor to Urban VI, died, and Pope Innocent VII was elected as his successor by the 8 cardinals available. Pope Innocent VII didn't live long, however. He died just 2 years later, in 1406. During his short reign, Innocent VII had remained opposed to meeting with the Avignon claimant, Benedict XIII, despite having taken an oath before his election to do everything in his power to end the schism, including abdication if necessary. As the schism persisted, members of both camps became increasingly frustrated with both claimants' unwillingness to take effective measures to end the schism. Quote, "Voices were heard on all sides demanding that union be restored. The University of Paris, or rather its 2 most prominent professors, John Gerson and Peter Daly, proposed that a general council should be summoned to decide between the rival claimants." End quote. In accordance with this widespread sentiment to take effective action to end the schism, another oath was taken before the election of Pope Innocent VII's successor. Quote, "Each of the 14 cardinals at the conclave following Pope Innocent VII's death swore that, if elected, he would abdicate, provided anti-Pope Benedict XIII did the same or should die. Also that he would not create new cardinals except to maintain parity of numbers with the Avignon cardinals, and that within 3 months he would enter into negotiations with his rival about a place of meeting." End quote. The very fact that the cardinals preparing to elect a true pope took an oath such as this, which included negotiations with an anti-pope, shows how horrible the situation was during the schism, and how much support the anti-pope had in Christendom. The conclave proceeded to elect Pope Gregory XII on November 30th, 1406. Hope that the end of the schism would come was renewed by Pope Gregory XII's negotiations with anti-Pope Benedict XIII. The two even agreed on a place to meet, but Pope Gregory XII wavered. He feared, and rightly so, the sincerity of anti-Pope Benedict XIII's intentions. Pope Gregory XII was also influenced against the path of resignation by some of his close relatives, who painted a negative picture of what might happen if he resigned. Cardinals of both camps get fed up. They go to Pisa and elect a new, quote, pope, in an impressive ceremony with cardinals from both sides. Quote, "As the negotiations between Pope Gregory XII and anti-Pope Benedict XIII dragged on, Gregory's cardinals became increasingly restive. An open break became inevitable when Gregory, suspicious of their loyalty, broke his pre-election promise, and on 4 May announced the creation of 4 new cardinals. All but 3 of his original college now left him and fled to Pisa." End quote. The 14 cardinals who left Pope Gregory XII's obedience and fled to Pisa were joined there by 10 cardinals who left anti-Pope Benedict XIII's obedience. The cardinals from the 2 camps had arranged a council, and were resolved to end the schism by means of a joint election at Pisa. Quote, "In the eyes of the world the Council of Pisa was indeed a glittering assembly, attended by 24 cardinals, 14 formerly adhering to Pope Gregory XII, 10 to De Luna, that is, anti-Pope Benedict XIII, 4 patriarchs, 80 bishops, 89 abbots, 41 priors, the heads of 4 religious orders, and representatives of virtually every university, crowned head, and great noble house in Catholic Europe." End quote. The Cardinal Archbishop of Milan gave the opening address at the Council of Pisa. He condemned both claimants, Gregory XII and anti-Pope Benedict XIII, and formally summoned them to appear at the council. They were declared contumacious when they did not appear. It must be stressed that at this point in the schism, 1409, people were so exasperated with the enduring disunion and the broken promises of the two claimants, that the assembly at Pisa was widely received and supported. It was made all the more impressive and appealing by the fact that its 24 cardinals were comprised of a substantial number of cardinals from both camps, that is, Pope Gregory XII's camp and anti-Pope Benedict XIII's camp. This gave it the appearance of a unified action of the Church's cardinals. On June 29, 1409, the 24 cardinals unanimously elected Alexander V. Now there were 3 claimants to the papacy at the same time. Father John Lau, Church History, page 405, says, quote, "There were now 3 popes and 3 colleges of cardinals, in some dioceses 3 rival bishops, and in some religious orders 3 rival superiors." End quote. It should also be noted that during this period, obviously many professing Catholics were receiving sacraments and having confessions heard by priests and bishops who had not been lawfully approved by true popes or bishops under true popes. Despite that fact, the Church has never called into question the validity of those sacraments or those confessions, recognizing the principle of supplied jurisdiction in such situations. The third claimant, the Pisan anti-pope, held the support of most of the theologians because he had the appearance of being the united choice of cardinals from both camps. The newly elected Pisan anti-pope, Alexander V, also held the widest support in Christendom among the 3 claimants. The true pope, Pope Gregory XII, had the least. From the beginning, Alexander V, quote, had the support of England, most of France, the Low Countries, Bohemia, Poland, his own Milan, Venice, and Florence. De Luna, that is, anti-Pope Benedict XIII, retained the support of his own Aragon, Castile, parts of southern France, and Scotland. Gregory XII, the true pope, was the weakest of the 3, retaining the loyalty only of Naples, western Germany, some northern Italian cities, and still true Carlo Malatesta of Rimini. The Great Western Schism had become a triangle of distorted loyalties, with the true pope the weakest of the 3. The Catholic Church seemed to be suffering the fate that would overtake later Protestantism. Repeated irrepressible subdivision, worst of all, no rescue from this disaster, seemed possible." End quote. Most of the learned theologians and canonists of the time favored the Pisan line of anti-popes. Quote, "Through the fall of 1408 and the winter of 1409, debate continued to rage among the theologians and canonists. Most of them, in varying degrees of desperation, now favored the council, regardless of who the true pope might be or how it was to be authorized." End quote. It should also be noted that during this period we saw the rise of the heresy of conciliarism, the idea that councils are superior to popes and can depose them, judge them, command them. No true pope in history had as little support as Pope Gregory XII near the end of the Great Western Schism. In 1411, the newly elected Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund followed the general sentiment and abandoned the true pope Gregory XII. Quote, "Sigismund wanted unanimous electoral endorsement, and in view of the widespread abandonment of Gregory XII by many of those who had previously obeyed him, notably in England and Italy, Sigismund's own confidence in Gregory's legitimacy may have been sincerely shaken. No true pope in the Church's history had so little support as Gregory XII following the Council of Pisa." End quote. The newly elected Pisan anti-pope, Alexander V, did not live long. He died less than a year after his election, in May of 1410. To succeed him on May 17, 1410, the Pisan cardinals unanimously elected Baldassare Cosa as John the 23rd. Like his predecessor, anti-pope Alexander V, John the 23rd also held the widest support among the 3 claimants. Quote, "While there were still 3 claimants to the papacy, John the 23rd commanded the widest support, with France, England, and several Italian and German states recognizing him. With the help of Louis of Anjou, he was able to establish himself in Rome." End quote. As we see, anti-pope John the 23rd was able to reign in Rome. John the 23rd, who reigned from 1410 to 1415, would be the last anti-pope to reign from Rome, until the post-Vatican II apostasy, which began with a man who also called himself John the 23rd, Angelo Roncalli. 1958 to 1963. With regard to the first antipope John the 23rd, during the fourth year of his reign as Antipope John the 23rd summoned the Council of Constance in 1414. It's quite interesting to note that the recent John the 23rd also called Vatican II in the fourth year of his reign, 1962. And both Antipope John the 23rds reigned for 5 years, 1410 to 1415 and 1958 to 1963 respectively. And like Vatican II, the Council of Constance began as a false council, having been called by an antipope. Moreover, both John the 23rds died shortly before the third session of their false council. So, to summarize the amazing similarities between the antipope John the 23rd of the Great Western Schism, the second Pisan antipope, and the recent John the 23rd who called Vatican II, both John the 23rds reigned for 5 years. Both of them called a false council. Both of them called the false council in the fourth year of their reign, and both of them died shortly before the third session of their false council. Moving back to the Great Western Schism. At this point in the schism, the Emperor Sigismund was determined to unite Christendom by working for the abdication of all three claimants. When Antipope John the 23rd realized that he would not be accepted as the true pope at the Council of Constance, he fled from the council. Quote, "That evening Cosa fled Constance, riding on a small dark horse, in contrast to the 9 white horses behind which he had entered the city in October. He huddled in a large gray cloak wrapped round him to hide most of his face and body." End quote. Antipope John the 23rd was then formally condemned by the Council of Constance as deposed. An order was sent out by the emperor for his arrest. He was apprehended and thrown into prison. In prison, Antipope John the 23rd, quote, "surrendered his papal seal and the fisherman's ring, with tears, to representatives of the council." End quote. He accepted the verdict against him without protest. Quote, "When the Council of Constance reckoned in part or whole the 16th General, 1414 to 1417, had deposed John, it entered into negotiations with Gregory, who conveyed to it his willingness to abdicate, provided he was allowed formally to convoke the assembled prelates and dignitaries afresh as a general council. As pope, he could not recognize a council called by John. This procedure was accepted, and at the 14th solemn session on 4 July 1415, Gregory's cardinal, John Dominici, read out his bull convoking the council, whereupon Pope Gregory XII announced his resignation. The 2 colleges of cardinals were united. Gregory's acts in his pontificate were ratified. So, after Antipope John the 23rd was deposed, Pope Gregory XII agreed to convoke the Council of Constance, in order to confer upon it papal legitimacy, which Antipope John the 23rd could not give it, and then he resigned in the hope of ending the schism. Meanwhile, Antipope Benedict XIII, the Avignon claimant, had been approached by Emperor Sigismund and asked to resign. He obstinately refused to the end, but by now the general sentiment had gone so far against him that his following was greatly diminished. Quote, "Sigismund, who had done all in his power to induce Benedict XIII of the Avignon line to abdicate, succeeded in detaching the Spaniards from his cause. Thereupon the council declared his deposition July 16, 1417." End quote. Both antipopes having been disposed of, and the true pope having resigned, the Council of Constance proceeded to elect Pope Martin V on November 11, 1417. Bringing an official end to the Great Western Schism. It should be noted that in choosing the new pope, voting was done by nations, something that was not in accord with the previous discipline of the Church, demonstrating that future popes could be elected in a way that is not, strictly speaking, in accord with the disciplinary laws in place at the time. That can be significant when considering the possibility of a future pope being elected by the assent of the Roman clergy, as it was done in the first millennium, even though the current discipline established by Pope Pius XII was election by the College of Cardinals. The Avignon line of antipopes did continue after the death of Antipope Benedict XIII, with the election of a new antipope, Clement VIII, as his successor by his 4 remaining cardinals. These cardinals then regarded that election of anti-Pope Clement VIII invalid and elected anti-Pope Benedict XIV. But by the time of the deposition of anti-Pope Benedict XIII by the Council of Constance, the Avignon line had lost so much support that these final two successors to anti-Pope Benedict XIII are so insignificant as to merit only a footnote. Conclusion: what the Great Western Schism teaches us for our time. In this discussion, we have reviewed one of the most important chapters in church history. In the process, we have seen a number of very important things quite relevant to our present situation. We've seen that anti-popes can exist. We've seen that anti-popes can reign from Rome. We've seen that all of the living cardinals, shortly after the election of Pope Urban VI, repudiated him, the true pope, and recognized anti-Pope Clement VII. This illustrates that it's not at all incompatible with indefectibility, that is, the promises of Christ to be with his church and the papacy until the end of time, for all of the cardinals to recognize an anti-pope. We've seen that most of the theologians of the time favored the third line, the Pisan line of anti-popes. This line of anti-popes must have been a tantalizing option for many, because cardinals from both camps supported it. This shows us how deceptive God will sometimes allow things to get without violating the essential promises he made to his church. Moreover, the majority of theologians' support for the Pisan line demonstrates clearly that the common teaching of theologians on a particular matter, for example, salvation, no matter how learned they are, is not binding, contrary to what some are asserting today. We've also seen that the principle that an open heretic cannot be regarded as the Pope is ancient and was expressed by the leading canonist of the time, Baldus. We've seen that things were so bad and so desperate during the Great Western Schism that people didn't see any way out of this disaster. A disaster in which people were offered at one point 3 rival bishops, 3 rival religious superiors, and 3 rival claimants to the papacy excommunicating one another. Learning this can help us see clearly that what we have proven on doctrinal grounds, namely that there has been a line of anti-popes since Vatican II that has foisted upon the world a new counterfeit religion, which has reduced the true Catholic Church to a remnant, in fulfillment of scriptural and Catholic prophecies about the deception of the great apostasy and the last days, is not a patent absurdity, as some have wrongly said. On the contrary, if God allowed the aforementioned disaster to occur during the Great Western Schism, which could have been at worst just a prelude to the great apostasy, with multiple anti-popes reigning at once, and the true pope the weakest of the 3, what kind of disaster and deception would he allow with anti-popes, without ever violating the essential promises he made to his church, during the final spiritual tribulation, which will be the most deceptive of them all, concerning which Scripture says that it will leave hardly any faith on earth, Luke 18:8, and deceive, if it were possible, even the elect, Matthew 24:24. It is a patent absurdity and directly refuted by Catholic teaching and the facts of church history to assert that a line of anti-popes, which has created a counterfeit sect to oppose the true church, is an impossibility. Further, it is outrageous in the extreme to assert that such a situation is, quote, patently absurd after having reviewed the undeniable facts we have put forward to prove it true. We will end this review of the Great Western Schism by quoting a passage from Father Edmund James O'Reilly. He had some very interesting things to say about the Great Western Schism in his book, The Relations of the Church to Society, Theological Essays, written in 1882. In the process, he mentions the possibility of a papal interregnum, a period without a pope, covering the whole period of the Great Western Schism, that is, almost 40 years. Quote, "We may stop here to inquire what is said of the position at that time of the 3 claimants and their rights with regard to the papacy. In the first place, there was all through, from the death of Gregory XI in 1378, a pope, with the exception, of course, of the intervals between deaths and elections to fill up the vacancies thereby created. There was, I say, at every given time a pope, really invested with the dignity of the vicar of Christ and head of the Church, whatever opinions might exist among many as to his genuineness. Not that an interregnum covering the whole period would have been impossible, or inconsistent with the promises of Christ, for this is by no means manifest, but that, as a matter of fact, there was not such an interregnum." End quote. Father O'Reilly says that an interregnum, that is, a period without a pope, covering the whole period of the Great Western Schism, is by no means incompatible with the promises of Christ about his church. The period Father O'Reilly is speaking of began in 1378 with the death of Pope Gregory XI and ended essentially in 1417 with the election of Pope Martin V. That's a 39-year interregnum. Writing after the First Vatican Council and its definitions on the perpetuity of the papal office, it's obvious that Father O'Reilly is on the side of those who, in rejecting anti-popes John XXIII, Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, hold the possibility of a long-term vacancy of the Holy See. In fact, on page 287 of his book, Father O'Reilly gives this prophetic warning, quote, "The great schism of the West suggests to me a reflection which I take the liberty of expressing here. If this schism had not occurred, the hypothesis of such a thing happening would appear to many chimerical, in other words, absurd. They would say it could not be. God would not permit the Church to come into so unhappy a situation. Heresies might spring up and spread and last painfully long, through the fault and to the perdition of their authors and abettors, to the great distress too of the faithful, increased by actual persecution in many places where the heretics were dominant. But that the true Church should remain between 30 and 40 years, without a thoroughly ascertained head, and representative of Christ on earth, this would not be, yet it has been, and we have no guarantee that it will not be again, though we may fervently hope otherwise. What I would infer is that we must not be too ready to pronounce on what God may permit. We know with absolute certainty that he will fulfill his promises. We may also trust that he will do a great deal more than what he has bound himself by his promises. We may look forward with cheering probability to exemption for the future from some of the trouble and misfortunes that have befallen in the past, but we, or our successors in the future generations of Christians, shall perhaps see stranger evils than have yet been experienced, even before the immediate approach of that great winding up of all things on earth that will precede the day of judgment. I am not setting up for a prophet, nor pretending to see unhappy wonders, of which I have no knowledge whatever. All I mean to convey is that contingencies regarding the Church, not excluded by the divine promises, cannot be regarded as practically impossible, just because they would be terrible and distressing in a very high degree." End quote. Father O'Reilly is saying that if the Great Western Schism had never occurred, people would say that such a situation is impossible and incompatible with the promises of Christ to his Church, and that we should not dismiss the possibility of similar and perhaps worse things in the future, because they would be distressing to a very high degree. For more information on this issue, consult our website, VaticanCatholic.com, and our article on this topic, The Great Western Schism and What It Teaches Us About the Post-Vatican II Apostasy.